the man behind the Gospels. What history can, and cannot, know about Jesus. From forbidden Enlightenment manuscripts to archaeology, memory studies, mythicism, and the continuing quest for Jesus of Nazareth. Prologue. The Name in the Stone. In June 1961, an Italian archaeological team working among the ruins of Caesarea Maritima uncovered a damaged block of limestone. It had been reused in a later staircase, its original purpose forgotten. Only portions of 4 Latin lines remained, but one name could still be read: Pontius Pilatus. The inscription identified Pilate not as a literary villain in a Christian drama, but as a Roman official, the prefect of Judea under the Emperor Tiberius. Here, unexpectedly, was a physical trace of the political world into which the Gospel accounts placed Jesus' death. The stone didn't prove that Pilate had interrogated Jesus. It didn't confirm the speeches in the Gospels, the release of Barabbas, the washing of hands, the crown of thorns, or the words placed above the cross. It did something at once smaller and more important. It confirmed that this particular man, bearing this particular title, governed Judea in the period in question. The Pilate stone is an almost perfect symbol of the historical problem of Jesus. What survives is fragmentary. The object is genuine, but its interpretation is limited. It illuminates the stage without reenacting the drama. It gives us a name, an office, an imperial context, and a reminder that history rarely returns an intact past. That is especially true of Jesus of Nazareth. No contemporary portrait survives. No letter in his handwriting has been found. No inscription erected during his lifetime names him. No official transcript of his trial exists. The first surviving Christian writings were composed by Paul roughly 2 decades after Jesus' death. The narrative Gospels came later. Yet the absence of an archive is not unusual for a lower status provincial figure in the Roman world, nor does the lack of contemporary paperwork mean that historians possess no evidence. It means that the evidence must be weighed rather than merely repeated. The result is one of the longest-running and most emotionally charged investigations in the history of scholarship. For Christians, Jesus is not merely an ancient subject, but the incarnate center of faith. For Jews, he must be understood within a Jewish world that later Christianity often misrepresented. For secular historians, he is a first-century figure around whom an enormously consequential religious movement formed. For skeptics, he is a test case in distinguishing history from legend. For mythicists, he may even be a literary or celestial construction who was later placed on earth. The debate therefore concerns several different questions that are too often confused. Did Jesus exist? What can be known about his life? How historically reliable are the Gospels? Did Jesus think he was the Messiah? Did he expect the end of the age? Was he a political threat? Did he perform miracles? Was his tomb found empty? What happened to his followers after his death? And finally, can historical investigation determine whether he was divine or rose bodily from the dead? These are not one question. They are a ladder of questions, and the strength of the evidence changes as one climbs. Modern scholarship has not produced a hidden biography waiting behind the Gospels. It has produced something both more modest and more intellectually compelling, a broad historical outline, surrounded by zones of probability, dispute, silence, and irreducible ambiguity. A recent Cambridge history of Jesus scholarship emphasizes precisely this need for modesty, noting that every reconstruction depends partly on methods and presuppositions brought to the evidence. The story of the historical Jesus is therefore also the story of those who searched for him, and of the many Jesuses they found. 1. The actual Jesus, the historical Jesus, and the Christ of faith. Before examining the sources, one distinction is essential. The actual Jesus is the total person who lived in first-century Galilee. Everything he thought, feared, remembered, said, intended, and did. That person is no longer directly accessible. The same is true of Socrates, Hillel, Spartacus, and nearly every non-elite figure of antiquity. Even a perfect archive would not recover the whole interior life of a human being. The historical Jesus is a modern reconstruction, the figure historians judge to be recoverable through surviving evidence and ordinary historical reasoning. This Jesus is not a newly discovered manuscript or a neutral photograph. He is an argument. Different scholars may agree on the sources, yet weight them differently, producing different portraits. The Christ of faith is Jesus, as confessed, worshipped, preached, and interpreted within Christian communities. Messiah, Son of God, risen Lord, second person of the Trinity, Savior of the world. That figure has a history, but theological claims about him cannot simply be equated with historical conclusions. The Catholic scholar John P. Meyer dramatized the distinction through a memorable thought experiment. Imagine, he suggested, a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, a Muslim, and an agnostic locked in the basement of Harvard Divinity School and forbidden to emerge until they had written a statement about Jesus on which all could agree using historical arguments alone. Meyer called this an unpapal conclave. His 5-volume A Marginal Jew was an attempt to approximate what such a group might produce. The thought experiment is useful, although it is not flawless. Scholars do not shed their cultures, politics, values, and assumptions merely by entering a library. Agreement is not the same as truth, and a consensus may exclude questions that matter. Nevertheless, Meyer captured the governing ideal of historical inquiry. Arguments should be understandable and accessible even by people who do not share the historian's religious commitments. This does not require historians to declare miracles impossible. It requires them to distinguish between two propositions. Ancient people reported that Jesus healed the sick and cast out demons. God suspended or redirected natural processes through Jesus. The first is historically investigable. The second introduces a theological explanation that ordinary historical methods cannot independently verify. A historian may personally believe it, reject it, or remain uncertain. But professional historical argument must first establish what the sources say, how early they are, how independent they may be, and what alternative explanations exist. Similarly, history can establish with considerable confidence that Jesus' followers came to believe he had appeared to them after his death. It can investigate when that conviction arose, who claimed an appearance, and how the belief transformed the movement. Whether the experiences were visions, grief-related phenomena, divine revelations, bodily encounters, or something else is a further question. The evidence does not force all historians to the same metaphysical conclusion. Historical judgments are thus comparative and probabilistic. Historians ask which explanation best accounts for the available evidence while requiring the fewest unsupported assumptions. They do not normally prove ancient events in the mathematical sense. They construct more or less persuasive accounts. The distinction also prevents two opposite mistakes. A believer cannot establish every gospel detail merely by proving that Jesus existed. A skeptic cannot disprove Jesus' existence merely by identifying legendary material in the Gospels. Real people acquire legends. Legendary stories can preserve memories of real events. The task is to determine how the two interact. 2. Before the quest, 4 Gospels, 1 sacred life. The problems did not begin with modern skepticism. Ancient Christians themselves knew that the 4 Gospels did not tell the story in exactly the same way. Their genealogies differ. Their sequences of events differ. John places Jesus' disruption of the temple near the beginning of his ministry, while the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place it during his final visit to Jerusalem. The Synoptics appear to present the Last Supper as a Passover meal. John's chronology appears to place Jesus' death before the Passover meal. The words spoken from the cross differ. The resurrection narratives vary in their characters, locations, and sequences. Ancient readers did not necessarily treat such differences as fatal. Some interpreted them allegorically. Others proposed harmonizations. Around the middle or latter part of the 2nd century, Tatian combined material from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John into a continuous narrative known as the Diatessaron. Instead of allowing 4 voices to remain side by side, Tatian produced one flowing story. His harmony became enormously influential in Syriac Christianity, remaining a standard gospel form in some communities for centuries. The instinct to harmonize reflected a theological assumption. The Gospels ultimately testified to one truth. Their differences, therefore, had to be compatible, even when readers could not immediately see how. Pre-modern interpreters were often highly sophisticated, but their principal objective was not to separate a recoverable human Jesus from later Christian belief. They read the Gospels within worship, doctrine, moral instruction, and contemplation. The conditions for a modern historical investigation emerged slowly. Renaissance humanism encouraged scholars to return to texts in their original languages. In 1516, Desiderius Erasmus published the first printed critical edition of the Greek New Testament. It was hurriedly prepared from only a handful of late manuscripts and contained problems of its own, but it placed Greek textual comparison at the center of European biblical study. Later, scholars accumulated manuscripts, compared variant readings, and gradually developed the discipline now called textual criticism. Textual criticism does not determine whether an event happened. It asks a prior question. What did the earliest recoverable form of a text probably say? Before historians can debate whether Mark accurately described Jesus, they must determine the wording of Mark. The discovery and comparison of thousands of manuscripts have made the New Testament one of the most intensively studied textual traditions in antiquity, although no original autograph of a New Testament book survives. The Reformation intensified scrutiny of Scripture, but neither Protestantism nor Catholic reform immediately created the historical Jesus as a separate object of research. The decisive intellectual shift required the possibility that biblical books might be studied in the same historical manner as other ancient writings. Baruch Spinoza helped open that door. His theological political treatise, published anonymously in 1670, treated biblical texts as products of particular authors, languages, political conflicts, and historical circumstances. Spinoza argued that interpretation should attend to context rather than begin with later dogmatic conclusions. His authorship quickly became known, and the book made him notorious across Europe. Spinoza did not write a modern life of Jesus. His importance was methodological. Once Scripture could be examined historically, Questions long contained by harmonization became more difficult to suppress. Who wrote each gospel? What sources did the authors use? Why do they disagree? Which traditions are early? Did the evangelists preserve events, reshape them, or create scenes to express theological convictions? Could Jesus' aims have differed from those of the religion founded in his name? The last question would explode into public controversy in the 18th century. 3. Reimarus and the manuscript that was not supposed to appear. Hermann Samuel Reimarus was a respected professor of Oriental languages in Hamburg. Publicly, he lived as a conventional member of educated Lutheran society. Privately, he composed an immense critique of revealed religion, commonly known as the Apology, or Defense for the Rational Worshippers of God. He did not publish it during his lifetime. Reimarus died in 1768. His manuscript might have remained a private family secret had it not come into the orbit of Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, playwright, philosopher, and librarian at the Ducal Library in Wolfenbüttel. Between 1774 and 1778, Lessing published portions of the manuscript under the deliberately obscure label Fragments of an Unknown Author. The resulting controversy became known as the Fragmentenstreit, the Battle of the Fragments. Clergy, theologians, and intellectuals attacked and defended the anonymous writer. Eventually, censorship authorities prohibited Lessing from continuing the public exchange. Reimarus's reconstruction was radical. He argued that Jesus must be separated from the message later preached by his disciples. Jesus, in Reimarus's view, was a Jewish messianic claimant who expected God to establish an earthly kingdom and liberate Israel. His cry of abandonment on the cross revealed the collapse of that expectation. The disciples, unwilling to return defeated to their former lives, allegedly stole the body, invented the resurrection, and transformed Jesus' failed political mission into a spiritual religion. Almost no contemporary specialist accepts Reimarus's conspiracy theory. It depends on psychological speculation, treats the disciples as unusually coordinated deceivers, and does not adequately explain the sincerity, diversity, and risks of the early Christian movement. Reimarus also reduced Jewish messianic hope too narrowly to political revolt. Yet his methodological challenge was revolutionary. He distinguished three things that Christian interpretation had often fused: what Jesus intended, what the disciples came to believe, what the gospel authors later narrated. Once separated, these categories could not easily be recombined. Even scholars who rejected Reimarus's conclusions inherited his question. Was the religion about Jesus identical to the religion of Jesus? The episode also established a recurring pattern. Historical Jesus research would repeatedly arrive in the form of scandal. A scholar would claim that the churches had confused faith with history. Defenders would accuse the scholar of reducing Jesus to the assumptions of the age. A new reconstruction would briefly appear liberating or devastating. Then later, scholarship would expose its own hidden premises. Reimarus's Jesus resembled an Enlightenment critic's idea of a failed political messiah. The next generation would try to preserve the gospel narratives by explaining their miracles naturally. That effort would produce some of the strangest biographies in the history of the field. 4. Rationalizing the miracles and discovering myth. Heinrich Eberhard Gottlob, Paulus, represented the rationalist stage of the 19th century quest. Paulus did not always accuse the evangelists of deception. Instead, he proposed that miraculous reports arose from ordinary events misunderstood by ancient observers. Jesus did not miraculously walk upon the sea. Perhaps he walked along the shore through mist or on an elevated bank that appeared, from a boat, to be the surface of the water. The multiplication of loaves could be interpreted as an inspiring act of sharing. Jesus and his disciples brought out their provisions, prompting the crowd to do the same. The resurrection could become a recovery from apparent death, the notorious swoon theory. These explanations attempted to preserve a historical event beneath each miracle, but they often demanded scenarios more implausible than the stories they were designed to replace. A half-dead Jesus escaping a sealed tomb and persuading his followers that he had conquered death was hardly an economical explanation. Rationalism could eliminate supernatural causation only by inventing unreported natural causes. Then, in 1835, a 27-year-old German theologian named David Friedrich Strauss published the first volume of The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. Strauss rejected both orthodox supernaturalism and the elaborate natural explanations of Paulus. The gospel writers, he argued, had not necessarily lied, nor had they simply mistaken sandbars for miracles. Rather, early Christian communities had interpreted Jesus through inherited Jewish scriptures, messianic expectations, and religious imagination. Stories grew because communities expressed what they believed Jesus must have been. Strauss called such stories myth. He did not mean merely a deliberate falsehood. Myth was a narrative expression of communal conviction. If Moses fed Israel with manna, the Messiah might be portrayed feeding crowds in the wilderness. If Elijah and Elisha raised the dead, Jesus would be narrated as surpassing them. Scriptural patterns supplied the language through which believers remembered and magnified him. The reaction was ferocious. Reviewers described the book in language normally reserved for treason or disease. Strauss lost any realistic prospect of a conventional university career. He received an appointment at Zurich, but public opposition was so intense that he was pensioned off before delivering his first lecture. Within about a decade, his enormous work was translated into English by Marion Evans, who later became famous as the novelist George Eliot. Strauss changed the debate because he recognized that the alternatives, accurate report and fraud, were inadequate. Traditions can develop without a conspiracy. Memory is not a recording device. Communities tell stories through available symbols. The gospel authors could sincerely proclaim theological truth while arranging, amplifying, or creating narrative forms. His conclusions were often excessively skeptical, and his model of anonymous communities generating stories could become vague. Later, scholars would recover a greater role for individual authors, eyewitness testimony, controlled tradition, and social memory. But no serious historical study could again assume that every narrative detail must derive from direct observation. At the same time, scholars began studying the literary relationship among the Gospels. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke often share wording, sequence, and narrative structure, they are called the Synoptic Gospels. They can be seen together. For centuries, many readers assumed Matthew was written first. During the 19th century, however, Markan priority gained ground. Scholars noticed that Mark is shorter, rougher in style, and often more difficult. Matthew and Luke appear to reproduce much of Mark, while refining its grammar, rearranging material, and adding teachings and birth narratives. Most contemporary scholars therefore judge that Mark preceded Matthew and Luke, although minority alternatives remain. Matthew and Luke also share substantial material absent from Mark, including versions of the Lord's Prayer and many sayings. In 1838, Christian Hermann Weisse proposed that they used Mark and another source, later designated Q from the German Quelle, meaning source. The two-source hypothesis eventually became the dominant explanation of the synoptic relationships. Q has never been found as a manuscript. It is a hypothetical reconstruction inferred from agreements between Matthew and Luke. Some scholars regard it as indispensable. Others follow versions of the Farah hypothesis, according to which Luke used Matthew directly, and no lost Q document is needed. The debate matters because scholars who accept Q may treat some of its traditions as earlier than Matthew and Luke, whereas scholars who reject it reconstruct the transmission history differently. Contemporary surveys continue to list Q among the field's major unsettled methodological questions. Source criticism produced a crucial realization. Agreement among three Gospels does not automatically constitute three independent witnesses. If Matthew and Luke copied Mark, then a story appearing in all three may derive from one written source. Conversely, differences may reveal an evangelist's theology. This opened the way for redaction criticism. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not merely containers of inherited traditions. They were authors who selected, omitted, arranged, and interpreted material. Mark's Jesus moves urgently toward suffering. Matthew presents Jesus as an authoritative interpreter of Torah and a teacher resembling Moses. Luke emphasizes reversal, poverty, the Spirit, and salvation extending outward from Jerusalem. John organizes the story around signs, extended discourses, and claims about Jesus' heavenly origin. The historical question was no longer simply, is this in the Bible? It became, why does this particular author tell the story this particular way? V. Renan's Beautiful Galilee and the Danger of the Scholar's Mirror. In 1863, Ernest Renan published Vie de Jésus, The Life of Jesus. Renan was a gifted stylist, trained in Semitic languages, and deeply attracted to the landscapes of the Eastern Mediterranean. His book presented Jesus as a sublime, religious genius, a gentle teacher whose message developed tragically as opposition grew. Renan called Jesus an incomparable man. To many readers, that sounded less like praise than a denial of divinity. The book became a sensation. Renan was denounced by church authorities and suspended from his position at the Collège de France. Renan's Jesus was more vivid than Strauss's collection of disputed traditions. The hills, villages, lakeshore, and sunlight of Galilee became part of the narrative. Yet the beauty concealed major historical problems. Renan romanticized Galilee as a landscape of freedom and simplicity, while depicting later developments in dark and culturally prejudiced terms. His work reflected 19th century Orientalism and racial assumptions, including the extraordinary suggestion that Jesus had, in some sense, transcended his Jewishness and become Aryan. That move, admiring Jesus by removing him from Judaism, would become one of the most damaging habits of Christian scholarship. The more admirable Jesus became, the more negatively Judaism was portrayed as his foil, legalistic where he was spiritual, tribal where he was universal, punitive where he was compassionate. Modern Jewish scholarship and historically responsible Christian scholarship have dismantled this contrast. Jesus' arguments over Torah, purity, Sabbath, temple, divorce, and resurrection were Jewish arguments within a diverse Jewish world. Renan's achievement and failure reveal a persistent temptation. A scholar can strip away dogma only to replace it with autobiography. The rationalist finds a rational Jesus. The liberal finds a liberal Jesus. The revolutionary finds a revolutionary Jesus. The mystic finds a mystic. The social reformer finds a reformer. The apocalyptic scholar finds a prophet of the end. No one exposed this problem more memorably than Albert Schweitzer. Before Schweitzer, however, William Wrede delivered another destabilizing blow. In The Messianic Secret of 1901, Wrede examined a peculiar pattern in Mark. Jesus heals people and commands them to remain silent. Demons recognize him, but he silences them. The disciples repeatedly fail to understand. Jesus' messianic identity appears hidden until after his death. Wrede argued that this pattern was not a transparent memory of Jesus' behavior. It was Mark's theological solution to a historical difficulty. If Jesus had openly presented himself as Messiah, why had so few recognized him? The secret allowed Mark to say that Jesus had been Messiah all along, though his identity became intelligible only after Easter. Few scholars now accept every part of Wrede's theory. Secrecy commands may have multiple functions, and some may preserve historical memories. But Wrede established that even Mark, the earliest narrative gospel in the majority view, was a theological composition, not an unprocessed eyewitness transcript. Then Schweitzer surveyed the entire field and pronounced judgment. 6. Schweitzer and the strange apocalyptic prophet. Albert Schweitzer's The Quest of the Historical Jesus, published in German in 1906, was originally titled more precisely, From Reimarus to Wrede, A History of Life of Jesus Research. It was not simply another biography. It was an autopsy of the biographies that had preceded it. Schweitzer argued that 19th century scholars repeatedly looked down the well of history and saw their own faces reflected back. Their Jesus had become a respectable modern European, ethical, reasonable, opposed to ritual, devoted to universal fatherhood and brotherhood, and conveniently detached from the unsettling apocalyptic expectations of ancient Judaism. But the earliest traditions did not depict a 19th century moral philosopher. Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God. He spoke of judgment, reversal, tribulation, the restoration of Israel, and the coming Son of Man. He gathered 12 disciples, suggesting the symbolic restoration of Israel's 12 tribes. He expected God to transform history. In Schweitzer's reconstruction, Jesus believed the final crisis was imminent and acted to bring it about. His death was bound to an apocalyptic expectation that did not unfold as anticipated. Schweitzer's own portrait was not universally accepted, and many details of his reconstruction have been abandoned. Yet his central insistence, that Jesus must be understood within Jewish eschatology rather than modern liberal optimism, remains enormously influential. Contemporary historical Jesus surveys still treat the apocalyptic question as one of the field's organizing problems. Schweitzer also demonstrated that historical reconstruction could threaten both orthodoxy and liberalism. The churches might be disturbed by a Jesus who expected an imminent end. Liberals were disturbed by a Jesus who seemed less modern, tolerant, and rational than the teacher they admired. The historical Jesus, Schweitzer suggested, might remain genuinely strange. He belonged to another symbolic universe. The historian's task was not to make him immediately agreeable, but to understand the world in which his language made sense. The irony is that Schweitzer's devastating book didn't end the search. It changed its terms. Scholars became increasingly skeptical that a continuous biography could be written at all. The age of the great lives of Jesus gave way to the age of fragments, forms, and community traditions. 7. Bultmann, form criticism, and the alleged no quest. During the early 20th century, scholars such as Carl Ludwig Schmidt, Martin Dibelius, and Rudolf Bultmann developed form criticism. Instead of treating the Gospels primarily as continuous biographies, they broke the narratives into smaller units: pronouncement stories, miracle stories, controversy dialogues, parables, sayings, legends, and passion traditions. These units, they argued, circulated orally before being assembled into written Gospels. Their forms reflected the needs of preaching, worship, controversy, teaching, and missionary activity in early Christian communities. A saying about Sabbath might have been preserved because Christians debated Sabbath. A miracle story might have been told in worship or evangelism. A pronouncement could acquire a narrative setting designed to make it memorable. Bultmann's History of the Synoptic Tradition, first published in 1921, applied this method with formidable rigor. He concluded that much of the gospel tradition had been shaped so extensively by early communities that a full biography of Jesus was impossible. The gospel narratives revealed the faith and preaching of the churches more directly than they revealed the sequence of Jesus' life. Bultmann did not conclude that Jesus never existed, nor did he believe nothing at all could be known. He accepted a minimal outline. Jesus was a Jewish teacher who proclaimed the coming reign of God and was crucified. But Christian faith, in his theology, did not rest on recovering a detailed psychological portrait. The proclaimed Christ confronted the hearer existentially in the present. This period is often called the No Quest, as though historical Jesus research ceased between Schweitzer and the 1950s. That label is misleading. Scholars continued writing about Jesus, and Jewish researchers, social historians, and others did not simply follow Bultmann's program. Recent histories warn against dividing the field into overly neat, self-contained quests. Still, Bultmann's influence was immense. His skepticism raised a theological danger for some of his students. If Christian proclamation could float almost entirely free from Jesus' actual history, what prevented the Church from creating a Christ of its own choosing? In 1953, Ernst Käsemann addressed a gathering of former Bultmann students and delivered a lecture titled "The Problem of the Historical Jesus." Käsemann argued that some continuity between Jesus and the Church's proclamation had to be historically investigated. Otherwise, Christian faith could become vulnerable to mythology, ideology, or political manipulation. The lecture is conventionally treated as the opening of the new quest. The new quest did not restore confidence in straightforward gospel biography. Instead, scholars developed criteria of authenticity, tests intended to identify traditions likely to derive from Jesus. Multiple attestation. A saying or event found in independent sources may be more likely to be early. If a theme appears in Mark, Q, Paul, and independent Johannine tradition, it cannot easily be attributed to one late evangelist. But the criterion depends on knowing which sources are independent. If Matthew and Luke copied Mark, 3 gospel appearances may represent one witness. If Q never existed, some supposed attestations disappear. Embarrassment. A tradition that created difficulty for early Christians may be less likely to have been invented. Jesus' baptism by John is the classic example. If Jesus was superior and sinless, why submit to another preacher's baptism of repentance? Matthew appears uncomfortable enough to add a dialogue in which John protests, and Jesus explains. Yet embarrassment is culturally unstable. What embarrasses a modern scholar may not have embarrassed an ancient community. Christians might preserve or create a difficult tradition because it served another theological purpose. Dissimilarity. a saying unlike both contemporary Judaism and the early Church was judged more likely to originate with Jesus. This criterion appeared rigorous, but carried a severe defect. Applied consistently, it created a Jesus disconnected from Judaism and from the movement that followed him. A Jewish teacher should sound Jewish. A founder should influence his followers. Dissimilarity could identify what was unusual, but it could not define the whole person. Coherence. Once a core of authentic material had been identified, other traditions consistent with that core could be accepted. The danger was circularity. A scholar's initial selection produced a particular Jesus, and coherence then admitted material resembling the Jesus already constructed. Historical plausibility. A tradition should make sense within first-century Jewish and Roman contexts and help explain the rise of the Jesus movement. This is indispensable, but context is broad. First-century Judaism was diverse, not a single checklist. Something can be contextually plausible without being historical. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, many scholars concluded that the criteria had been asked to perform more than they could. They were useful considerations, not mechanical detectors. The sharp division between authentic and inauthentic also misunderstood memory. Even a genuine memory comes interpreted, while a reshaped tradition may preserve a historical core. Recent methodological work has therefore challenged the entire binary model. 8. Recovering Jesus the Jew. One of the most important changes in 20th century scholarship was not the discovery of a new gospel. It was the recovery of Jesus' Jewish identity. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered beginning in 1947, revealed a Jewish world filled with scriptural interpretation, ritual practice, apocalyptic expectation, communal meals, purity concerns, messianic speculation, and disagreement over the temple. The scrolls do not mention Jesus and are not evidence for his individual life. Their importance is contextual. Ideas once treated as uniquely Christian could now be located within the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. Post-Holocaust scholarship also confronted the lethal history of Christian anti-Judaism. Older portraits had often defined Jesus through opposition to a caricatured Judaism. More historically responsible work recognized that disputes attributed to Jesus were generally family arguments within Judaism. Pharisees, Sadducees, priestly elites, apocalyptic groups, ordinary villagers, scribes, and followers of charismatic teachers did not represent a single position. In 1973, Geza Vermes published Jesus the Jew. Vermes, a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Jewish history, situated Jesus among charismatic Jewish holy men associated with prayer, healing, and intimate confidence in God. He compared Jesus with figures such as Honi the circle drawer and Hanina ben Dosa. His Jesus was not a Greek philosopher accidentally living in Galilee, but a Jewish teacher and healer whose later titles had to be interpreted within Jewish categories. Vermes's comparisons were illuminating, but not complete. A charismatic holy man does not by itself explain Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom, the symbolic 12, the confrontation in Jerusalem, or Roman crucifixion. Yet Jesus the Jew helped make an indispensable principle unavoidable. Any plausible Jesus must fit first-century Judaism. E.P. Sanders pushed the argument further in Jesus and Judaism in 1985. Rather than beginning with isolated sayings and trying to certify them individually, Sanders began with what he called almost indisputable facts. Jesus was baptized by John, became a Galilean preacher and healer, called disciples and spoke of 12, directed his activity primarily to Israel, became involved in a temple controversy, was crucified by Roman authority, and left behind a continuing movement. Sanders then asked which reconstruction best explained the whole pattern. His answer was Jewish restoration eschatology. Jesus expected God to restore Israel. The 12 symbolized renewed Israel. His temple action was not merely a protest against dishonest currency exchange. It was a prophetic sign of judgment and eschatological replacement. That symbolic challenge helped set in motion the events leading to his execution. Sanders changed the field's center of gravity. What Jesus did, gathering followers, approaching Jerusalem, acting in the temple, could sometimes be historically more revealing than attempting to authenticate every sentence attributed to him. Other scholars developed the Jewish and apocalyptic portrait in different directions. Paula Fredrickson emphasized pilgrimage, Passover crowds, Roman power, and the explosive political implications of messianic enthusiasm. Dale Allison presented Jesus as a millenarian prophet whose sayings and actions reveal recurrent apocalyptic patterns. Amy Jill Levine insisted that Jesus must not be made admirable by turning Judaism into his moral opposite. John P. Meyer accumulated evidence with deliberate caution across thousands of pages. This broad movement is commonly called the Third Quest, although the label covers scholars who disagree profoundly. What united many of them was greater attention to Judaism, archaeology, social history, and the political conditions of Roman Palestine. But while some scholars found an apocalyptic prophet, others found a social revolutionary, a wisdom teacher, a charismatic healer, or an egalitarian peasant. By the 1980s and 1990s, these disagreements became public theater. 9. The Jesus Seminar and the Jesus Wars. In 1985, Robert Funk founded the Jesus Seminar, a group of scholars who met to evaluate sayings and deeds attributed to Jesus. Their voting method became famous. Each participant dropped a colored bead into a box. Red indicated that Jesus almost certainly said something, pink that he probably said something like it, gray that the saying was doubtful but might reflect his ideas, black that it came from later tradition. The votes were aggregated and published. According to the seminar's own summary, its members judged roughly 18% of gospel sayings and 16% of narrated deeds authentic. The colored beads were irresistible to journalists. A complex historical problem could now be photographed. Headlines announced that scholars had voted on whether Jesus said the Lord's Prayer or predicted his death. Traditional Christians saw an elite committee deleting the Gospels. Some academics saw public relations masquerading as precision. The seminar nevertheless raised important questions. It brought non-canonical texts such as the Gospel of Thomas into public discussion. It emphasized that the canonical boundary is theological and historical, not an automatic guarantee that every canonical tradition is earlier than every non-canonical one. It encouraged public access to scholarship rather than confining debate to technical journals. Its weaknesses were equally real. A numerical vote could conceal the assumptions determining the result. The group was not statistically representative of all New Testament scholars. Some participants favored a non-apocalyptic Jesus in advance, treated brief aphorisms as earlier than apocalyptic sayings, and assigned high value to the Gospel of Thomas. The resulting Jesus often resembled a witty countercultural sage. John Dominic Crossan, one of the seminar's most prominent figures, offered the unforgettable description of Jesus as a Mediterranean Jewish peasant. Crossan emphasized aphorisms, parables, healing, open meals, and a brokerless relationship with God. Jesus enacted an egalitarian kingdom in the present by crossing boundaries of purity, class, and status. Crossan drew cautious parallels with Cynic-style social provocation, although his Jesus remained located in Jewish tradition. Marcus Borg described Jesus as a spirit-filled person, wisdom teacher, social prophet, and movement founder. Burton Mack emphasized layers of sayings, tradition, and the social formation of early communities. These portraits resisted an overwhelmingly future-oriented apocalypse. At the opposite side of the public debate, N.T. Wright argued that Jesus symbolically enacted Israel's God returning to Zion, announced the end of exile, challenged the temple establishment, and understood himself as possessing a messianic vocation. Wright gave the canonical narratives greater historical weight than Crossan did, and argued extensively for the bodily resurrection. Cambridge scholarship has used Crossan and Wright as revealing case studies, because each offers a large, coherent account while making very different judgments about sources and historical explanation. The Jesus Wars demonstrated that scholars were not merely disagreeing about individual verses. They disagreed about the shape of the evidence. Should short, memorable sayings be privileged over apocalyptic speeches? Is the Gospel of Thomas early and independent, or largely dependent on developing Christian tradition? Does Jesus' execution require a politically threatening message? Was the kingdom principally present in transformed social relationships, or future in an imminent act of God? Did Jesus claim a messianic role, or did his followers assign it after his death? No colored bead could settle those questions. 10. The Evidence Dossier. 1. Paul, the earliest surviving witness. The earliest surviving Christian writings are not the Gospels, but the generally accepted letters of Paul, composed during the 50s CE, perhaps beginning in the late 40s, depending on the dating of Galatians. Paul wrote within roughly 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death. His letters are the earliest direct testimony from a known follower of the Jesus movement. Paul never presents a continuous life of Jesus. He says nothing about Bethlehem, Nazareth, parables of the prodigal son or Good Samaritan, most miracles, the Sermon on the Mount, or a trial before Pilate. He does not name Mary. He does not narrate an empty tomb. This silence is a central point in the mythicist argument. If Paul believed in a recently living teacher, why does he say so little about him? The answer begins with genre. Paul was not writing biographies or introductory catechisms. He addressed communities that already worshipped Jesus, responding to disputes over circumcision, meals, sex, spiritual gifts, resurrection, leadership, and money. People rarely restate an entire shared narrative every time they write about a particular controversy. Even so, Paul supplies more earthly information than is sometimes acknowledged. Jesus was born as a human and under Jewish law. Paul associates him with Davidic descent, although the phrase may derive from an inherited confession. Jesus had brothers. He was crucified. He was buried. He taught about divorce, the support of religious messengers, and the ritual meal later called the Lord's Supper. Paul knows Peter, whom he calls Cephas, and James. The most arresting evidence occurs in Galatians. Paul reports traveling to Jerusalem and spending 15 days with Cephas. He says he saw no other apostle except James, the brother of the Lord. He later names James, Cephas, and John as recognized leaders. Pause over the human scale of that encounter. Within a few years of joining the movement, Paul spent 2 weeks with one of Jesus' principal followers and met the man identified as Jesus' brother. Paul and Peter later quarreled publicly at Antioch. These are not distant names embedded in a medieval legend. They are living rivals and negotiating partners inside Paul's own argumentative correspondence. Some mythicists interpret Brother of the Lord as a purely religious title meaning an ordinary Christian. But Paul distinguishes James in a way that appears familial, and elsewhere refers collectively to the brothers of the Lord. Josephus would later identify James as the brother of Jesus called Christ. The biological reading is therefore more natural, though arguments over the terminology continue. Paul also preserves traditions older than his letters. In 1 Corinthians 11, he recounts words associated with Jesus' final meal. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says he received and handed on a formula affirming that Christ died, was buried, was raised, and appeared to Cephas, the 12, James, the apostles, and finally Paul. Scholars widely regard at least part of this formula as pre-Pauline, although its exact age and wording remain debated. Historically, this establishes that resurrection belief did not arise centuries later. It was present in the first generation, and probably very soon after Jesus' death. It does not, by itself, establish what caused the experiences, or whether every listed appearance had the same character. Paul includes his own visionary encounter in the sequence, yet does not describe the others in narrative detail. Paul is therefore both invaluable and frustrating. He brings us closer in time than the Gospels, personally knew central members of the Jerusalem movement, and preserves very early traditions. But he writes as an apostle and theologian, not as a neutral biographer. His Jesus is already the crucified and exalted Lord. That is not evidence that an earthly Jesus was absent. It is evidence that theological interpretation began almost immediately. 2. The canonical Gospels, memory, literature, and theology. The 4 canonical Gospels remain the richest sources for Jesus, but richness is not the same as transparency. Most scholars date Mark around the Jewish war and destruction of the Temple in 70 CE, allowing a range on either side. Matthew and Luke are commonly placed in the final decades of the 1st century, and John near the end of that century or beginning of the 2nd. These ranges are debated, but all 4 narrative Gospels are generally dated decades after Jesus' death. Mark is widely judged the earliest, and a major source for Matthew and Luke. The texts do not identify their authors in the modern manner. The traditional names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attached early in their transmission and may preserve genuine traditions, but the precise authorship of each remains disputed. Arguments for eyewitness or eyewitness-connected authorship continue, especially concerning John and Mark. Arguments for formal anonymity emphasize that the narratives themselves do not straightforwardly name their composers. Calling the Gospels anonymous does not mean their authors knew nothing, nor does calling them ancient biographies mean they meet modern biographical standards. Ancient biographers could arrange material thematically, invent or paraphrase speeches, interpret character through anecdotes, and place meaning above exhaustive chronology. The evangelists inherited traditions in several forms, remembered sayings, liturgical formulas, miracle stories, controversy accounts, parables, scriptural interpretations, and a relatively developed passion narrative. Some traditions may have been transmitted by eyewitnesses, others passed through several performers and communities. Oral transmission can preserve memorable cores while changing wording, setting, emphasis, and sequence. The Gospels also contain evidence of literary construction. Matthew and Luke reproduce Mark closely in places, demonstrating direct or indirect textual dependence. Both alter Mark. Luke explicitly says that many others had attempted narratives, and that he investigated traditions to produce an orderly account. John presents long speeches with a vocabulary and style markedly different from the short aphorisms and parables typical of the synoptics. The responsible conclusion is neither the Gospels are stenographic transcripts, nor the Gospels are novels without historical value. They are ancient theological narratives built from inherited material, authorial composition, scriptural interpretation, and communal memory. Their differences are historically significant. Matthew and Luke alone contain infancy narratives. Matthew places Jesus' birth under Herod the Great, tells of Magi, a star, a massacre, and a flight into Egypt. Luke connects the birth with a census associated with Quirinius and describes shepherds, angelic songs, and a journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Herod died in 4 BCE, while the well-attested census under Quirinius occurred in 6 CE. Proposed harmonizations exist, but no solution commands broad agreement. Many historians therefore judge the infancy narratives more valuable for understanding Matthew's and Luke's theology than for establishing a precise birth chronology. The Bethlehem tradition may reflect a conviction that the Messiah should come from David's city. Jesus is independently and repeatedly associated with Nazareth, making Nazareth the more historically secure place of upbringing and possibly birth. The Gospel chronologies also differ over the length of Jesus' public activity. The Synoptics narrate one final Passover in Jerusalem and can be read as implying a relatively short ministry. John mentions several festivals and at least 3 Passovers, suggesting a ministry lasting 2 or more years. Scholars debate whether John preserves independent chronological information or expands the ministry for literary and theological reasons. The temple incident occurs near the end in the Synoptics, but near the beginning in John. Some traditional harmonizations posit 2 temple incidents. Most historians consider one event more likely and ask which evangelist relocated it. The synoptic placement offers an intelligible connection to Jesus' arrest, though John's account may preserve independent details. The Passion narratives agree on the central sequence. Jesus entered Jerusalem, came into conflict, ate a final meal with followers, was arrested, and was crucified under Pilate. But they differ over timing, hearings, dialogue, and responsibility. John presents Jesus dying when Passover lambs were being prepared, a chronology rich in symbolism. The synoptics more clearly identify the last meal as Passover. At the cross, Mark and Matthew preserve a cry of abandonment. Luke gives words of forgiveness and trust. John presents a controlled declaration of completion. These may reflect different remembered sayings, theological selection, or literary composition. The historian cannot simply combine every saying into a single sequence without erasing what each author is doing. The resurrection narratives diverge even more visibly. Who goes to the tomb? How many heavenly messengers are present? Do the disciples encounter Jesus in Galilee or Jerusalem? Does Jesus appear first to Mary Magdalene, to a group of women, to Peter, or to others? Paul's early list names Cephas first and doesn't mention the women. These tensions do not prove that nothing happened. They show that the Easter tradition developed through different communities and narrative purposes. The earliest historically secure conclusion is not the complete, harmonized sequence. It is that some followers became convinced very soon after Jesus' execution that he had appeared to them and that God had raised him. 3. Josephus, 2 passages, and a modern surprise. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat, priest, military commander, participant in the revolt against Rome, Roman captive, and eventually an author living under imperial patronage. He completed his Jewish antiquities around 93 or 94 CE. Jesus appears in the surviving text twice. The less dramatic passage occurs in Book 20. Josephus describes the high priest Ananus convening a council during a temporary gap in Roman administration and arranging the execution of the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James. The great majority of specialists judge this passage authentic, although a minority argues for interpolation or textual alteration. The passage is important precisely because Jesus is not its main subject. Josephus is explaining the fate of James and identifies him through the better-known Jesus. The language is restrained. Jesus is the one called Christ, not necessarily the one Josephus personally accepted as Messiah. The more famous passage occurs in Book 18 and is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. In its received Christian manuscript form, it calls Jesus a wise man, describes extraordinary deeds, reports his crucifixion under Pilate, refers to appearances after 3 days, and seems to declare that he was the Messiah. The overtly Christian phrases have long raised suspicion. Would Josephus, who remained Jewish and never joined the church, simply affirm that Jesus was the Christ and fulfilled the prophets? 3 broad positions emerged. Josephus wrote the entire passage substantially as it survives. Josephus wrote a neutral core that Christian copyists embellished. The whole passage is a Christian interpolation. For much of recent scholarship, the second position has been common. Josephus probably mentioned Jesus, his execution, and his continuing followers, while later scribes strengthened the language. But the debate is not closed. In 2025, T.C. Schmidt published Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ, arguing for a much stronger defense of the passage's authenticity, and proposing that Josephus may have had access to people connected with Jesus' trial. The claim attracted considerable attention. In a 2026 scholarly review, Steve Mason concluded that Schmidt's arguments for authenticity deserved serious consideration, but that the sensational claim of eyewitness informants did not adequately explain the evidence. That exchange is a vivid reminder that historical Jesus scholarship is not merely recycling 19th century questions. Even one of the most studied paragraphs in ancient literature can generate new arguments over wording, transmission, sources, and context. Josephus does not provide an independent gospel. At most, he confirms a few points. A Jesus called Christ was known, Pilate condemned him, a movement continued, and James was identified as his brother. That is limited evidence, but limited evidence can still be significant. 4. Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, and Roman indifference. Around 116 CE, the Roman senator and historian Tacitus described Nero's persecution of Christians after the fire of Rome in 64. Tacitus wrote that Christus, from whom the group took its name, had suffered the death penalty during the reign of Tiberius by sentence of Pontius Pilate. The passage is hostile to Christianity, making Christian interpolation unlikely. It independently confirms that Roman elites in the early 2nd century understood the movement to have originated with an executed figure in Judea. Its limitations are substantial. Tacitus wrote about 80 years after Jesus' death. He does not reveal his source. He may have consulted official information, repeated knowledge circulating among Roman administrators, or relied indirectly on Christian claims. He calls Pilate a procurator, whereas the Caesarea inscription identifies Pilate's contemporary title as prefect. Procurator may reflect the terminology current in Tacitus's own era. Pliny the Younger, governing Bithynia Pontus around 111 to 113, wrote to the Emperor Trajan asking how to deal with Christians. He reported that they assembled before dawn and sang hymns to Christ as to a god. Pliny provides important evidence for Christian worship and organization, but almost no independent information about Jesus' life. Suetonius reports that the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because they were repeatedly rioting at the instigation of Chrestus. This may reflect conflicts over Christ among Roman Jews, but Chrestus was also a personal name, and the wording could imply someone present in Rome. The passage is too ambiguous to carry much historical weight. These Roman sources matter most cumulatively. They show that by the early 2nd century, non-Christian writers knew of a movement named for an executed Christus and spreading from Judea. They do not verify the Sermon on the Mount, miracles, or resurrection. The small amount of Roman attention is not surprising. Jesus did not command an army, govern a province, write to the Senate, or lead a revolt that entered Roman annals. From an imperial perspective, his execution was one local act of public violence among many. Christianity became historically visible to Roman authors when its communities became administratively troublesome. 5. Archaeology, reconstructing the stage. No artifact can be confidently identified as an object owned by Jesus. Archaeology has not produced his workshop, clothing, cup, or skeleton. Claims involving holy relics require separate evaluation and generally cannot bear the weight placed upon them. What archaeology can reconstruct is the physical and social world in which Jesus lived. Excavation confirms that Nazareth was an inhabited Jewish village in the early Roman period, probably with a population in the hundreds. This matters because an older, skeptical claim held that Nazareth did not exist during Jesus' lifetime. The archaeological evidence has made that position increasingly untenable. Galilee was largely rural and agrarian. Farmers, fishers, craftsmen, and laborers lived close to subsistence, though the region was not uniformly destitute. Jesus' parables of sowing, harvesting, debt, vineyards, household lamps, lost coins, hired labor, sheep, and fishing fit this environment remarkably well. Capernaum was a Jewish fishing and agricultural village on the Sea of Galilee. Excavated houses, streets, tools, and domestic spaces help historians imagine the setting of traditions involving fishing households, crowded rooms, local patronage, and itinerant teaching. Sepphoris, an important urban center, rebuilt by Herod Antipas, lay only a few miles from Nazareth. Some scholars have speculated that Jesus or his family may have worked there, particularly if tekton, the Greek term applied to Jesus or Joseph, means a general builder or craftsman rather than specifically a carpenter. No source says Jesus visited Sepphoris, however. Proximity makes contact possible, not proven. Language presents a similar spectrum of probability. Aramaic was probably Jesus' primary spoken language. He may have known enough Hebrew for scriptural and religious settings. Greek circulated in Galilee, especially in trade and urban contexts, making some conversational knowledge possible. Whether Jesus could read and write at a high level remains disputed. Gospel scenes in which he reads or writes cannot simply be treated as educational records. The Pilate stone confirms the prefect. Coins, inscriptions, roads, ritual baths, stone vessels, synagogues, fishing installations, and the monumental remains of Jerusalem confirm the broader environment. Archaeology can show that Gospel writers sometimes knew real geography and social practices. It can also expose anachronisms or oversimplifications. But archaeology does not convert the Gospels into transcripts. A novelist can describe a real city. A theological author can preserve accurate geography. Historical setting and historical event must be evaluated separately. 11. Did Jesus exist? The mythicist challenge. Among specialists in ancient Judaism, early Christianity, classics, and New Testament history, the existence of Jesus is accepted by an overwhelming majority, including scholars who reject Christian theology. That consensus is not based on assuming the Gospels are inerrant. It rests principally on Paul, early and multiple traditions, the existence of named first-generation associates, Josephus's reference to James, and the explanatory difficulty of deriving the entire movement from a purely celestial figure. Nevertheless, the historicity question should not be dismissed with ridicule. James Carleton. Paget Meggitt has argued that scholars should scrutinize the debate more carefully, clarify its terminology, and avoid misleading accounts of its history. A conclusion can be strong without making the question illegitimate. Modern mythicism takes several forms. Its better arguments are not simply that miracles do not happen. A person can exist even if miracle stories about that person are legendary. The stronger mythicist case emphasizes 5 points. First, Paul provides little earthly biography. His Christ appears as a cosmic, revealed figure whose death has universal and supernatural significance. Paul does not explicitly place the crucifixion in Jerusalem or name Pilate. Second, the Gospels were written decades later, are deeply shaped by Scripture, and contain legendary and contradictory material. Third, stories about dying, exalted, or saving figures circulated throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Christianity may have combined Jewish apocalyptic expectations with broader mythic patterns. Fourth, the Testimonium Flavianum contains Christian language Tacitus wrote late, and other external sources may ultimately depend on what Christians themselves said. Fifth, no contemporary administrative or literary record of Jesus survives. Some mythicists, including Richard Carrier, have proposed that the earliest Jesus was a celestial being, believed to have been crucified in a supernatural realm, and only later historicized. Others regard Jesus as a composite assembled from scriptural and cultural materials. Raphael Latasta has defended agnosticism about existence rather than categorical non-existence. These arguments correctly emphasize weaknesses in the evidence. Paul is frustratingly silent about many matters. Gospel narratives do use Jewish scripture creatively. Josephus's principal Jesus passage has been altered or at least seriously disputed. Tacitus is not contemporary. No archaeological object proves Jesus himself. Yet the non-historical hypothesis faces greater cumulative difficulties. Paul knows people he identifies as Jesus's principal associate and brother. He distinguishes the Jerusalem leadership from his own later apostleship. His disputes with them are concrete and socially awkward. A purely celestial Christ hypothesis must reinterpret brother of the Lord, explain why Jesus acquired a recent family and followers, and account for how multiple communities came to place him within the same narrow historical setting. Paul's silence is also selective rather than total. He knows a human birth, Jewish identity, brothers, a final meal tradition, teachings, crucifixion, burial, and appearances. His letters presuppose, rather than narrate, a story. The gospel use of Scripture does not require a wholly invented protagonist. Ancient writers routinely interpreted real people through scriptural patterns. Alexander the Great, Augustus, Apollonius of Tyana, and later rabbis all acquired elaborated narratives. The crucifixion itself is an odd foundation for a freely invented Jewish Messiah. Crucifixion signified Roman domination, shame, and apparent divine abandonment. Early Christians developed powerful theological interpretations of it, but the need for those interpretations is readily explained if their leader had actually suffered this catastrophic death. The absence of contemporary records is weak negative evidence. Most Galilean villagers and executed provincials vanished without documentation. Roman archives were not comprehensively preserved, and ancient historians selected events according to elite political importance. The simplest cumulative explanation remains that a Jewish teacher named Jesus gathered followers, was crucified, and was rapidly reinterpreted through resurrection belief, scripture, worship, and missionary expansion. That conclusion is historically substantial, but religiously minimal. It does not establish that Jesus was divine, that every gospel episode occurred, or that the resurrection was supernatural. It establishes a founder beneath the developing traditions. 12. The major competing portraits. The existence of Jesus is less disputed than his identity and intention. Several broad portraits dominate the modern debate. They overlap, and many scholars combine elements from more than one. 1. Jesus the apocalyptic prophet. This remains one of the strongest and most widely defended models. Its major advocates have included Schweitzer, Zanders, Paula Fredrickson, Dale Allison, Bart Ehrman, and others, though they differ considerably. The case is cumulative. Jesus began in the orbit of John the Baptist, who proclaimed judgment. The kingdom of God stood at the center of Jesus' message. He chose 12 followers, suggesting restored Israel. He taught a prayer asking for God's kingdom to come. He spoke of reversal, judgment, banquet, harvest, and the Son of Man. He approached Jerusalem at Passover. He performed a prophetic action in the temple. The early Pauline communities expected an approaching transformation. Within this model, Jesus believed God would soon act decisively to judge evil, restore Israel, vindicate the faithful, and inaugurate a transformed world. His healings and exorcisms functioned as signs that Satan's rule was collapsing. Meals anticipated the eschatological banquet. The chief problem is determining what soon meant, and how much language derives from Jesus rather than post-Easter communities. Some sayings imply that the decisive events would occur within the current generation. Others suggest the kingdom was already present in Jesus' activity. Scholars debate whether Jesus expected a literal cosmic transformation, a symbolic national restoration, his own death and vindication, or an open-ended future. Dale Allison's approach is especially important. Rather than claiming certainty about every saying, Allison looks for recurrent patterns. Even if individual apocalyptic sayings cannot be certified, the aggregate tradition repeatedly points in the same direction. His recent work continues to address eschatology, miracles, women, memory, and the limitations of historical method. 2. Jesus the wisdom teacher and social prophet. Crossan, Borg, and related scholars emphasize aphorisms, parables, meals, healing, and boundary crossing. In this portrait, the kingdom is not only a future divine intervention, but a transformed way of living in the present. Jesus tells people to love enemies, relinquish status, forgive debts, welcome outsiders, and recognize divine generosity. His meals challenge hierarchies. His parables overturn conventional expectations. He refuses systems that mediate access to God through status and patronage. This model explains why Jesus' short sayings remain compelling and why traditions associate him with tax collectors, women, the poor, and socially stigmatized people. It also captures the performative quality of his ministry. The kingdom is enacted, not merely predicted. Its weakness is the risk of filtering out inconvenient apocalyptic material. If all future-oriented sayings are attributed to the later church, the resulting Jesus may look suspiciously like a modern, progressive religious teacher. The apocalyptic context supplied by John the Baptist, the 12 Jerusalem, and early Christianity remains difficult to remove. The strongest synthesis holds that present practice and future expectation were not alternatives. Jesus may have enacted in meals and healings the restoration he expected God soon to complete. 3. Jesus the charismatic healer and holy man. Worm's Jewish charismatic model begins with the broad attestation of healings and exorcisms. Jesus was remembered not merely as a lecturer, but as someone from whom power was believed to flow. Historians cannot determine through ordinary methods whether supernatural cures occurred. They can conclude that Jesus acquired a reputation as a healer and exorcist early and across different streams of tradition. Even hostile gospel characters sometimes explain his power as demonic rather than denying it, which suggests that remarkable activity was central to his public image. Anthropology complicates modern categories. Ancient people did not sharply distinguish physical, psychological, social, and spiritual illness. A person restored from an affliction might experience bodily improvement, reintegration into family, release from stigma, and religious transformation simultaneously. The healer model explains Jesus' attraction among villagers, but by itself it does not explain crucifixion. Rome did not normally crucify local healers. The healing activity must be connected with a larger kingdom movement, public following, or perceived political danger. 4. Jesus, the prophet of Israel's restoration. Sanders and Wright, in different ways, emphasize symbolic actions concerning Israel. The selection of 12 represented the tribes. Jesus' meals anticipated restoration. His proclamation concerned Israel's God becoming king. The temple action symbolically announced judgment. Jesus' movement, therefore, had national and eschatological implications, even if it was not an armed revolt. Wright argues that Jesus understood Israel as continuing in a condition analogous to exile despite living in the land. Through his ministry, Jesus announced divine return and embodied Israel's destiny. His journey to Jerusalem and death were intentional parts of a messianic vocation. Critics argue that Wright sometimes reads later Christian theology back into Jesus' self-understanding. The evidence that Jesus consciously identified himself with Israel's God or anticipated the theological meaning of his death is disputed. Still, the restoration model integrates more data than a portrait limited to detached sayings. 5. Jesus, the political threat. Crucifixion was a Roman punishment associated especially with slaves, rebels, brigands, and threats to order. The inscription, King of the Jews, whether mockery or formal charge, is political language. Jesus entered Jerusalem amid public enthusiasm, disrupted activity in the temple, and was executed during Passover, a festival charged with memories of liberation from foreign rule. These facts make a purely apolitical Jesus difficult to sustain. Some scholars have therefore portrayed Jesus as a revolutionary or insurgent. Earlier versions attempted to associate him closely with zealot violence. More recent political readings focus on peasant resistance, class conflict, imperial extraction, and symbolic opposition, rather than claiming that Jesus led an armed cell. The evidence for armed revolt is weak. Jesus' followers do not appear to have fought Rome in any organized manner. Traditions of enemy love, non-retaliation, and surrender complicate the revolutionary hypothesis. The isolated presence of a sword in the arrest narratives does not establish a military program. A more plausible conclusion is that Jesus was politically dangerous without being a conventional military revolutionary. A prophet announcing God's kingdom, attracting crowds, symbolically challenging the temple, and being acclaimed in royal language could alarm both local authorities and Pilate. Rome did not need evidence of an army before eliminating a potential disturbance. 6. Jesus, the Jewish teacher of Torah. Jesus debates Sabbath, purity, divorce, oaths, food, love of neighbor, and the greatest commandment. These are Jewish ethical and legal questions. Older scholarship often portrayed him as abolishing Judaism's law in favor of universal love. That contrast is historically misleading. Debating how commandments should be interpreted is not rejecting Torah. Prophets and rabbis also prioritized mercy, justice, intention, and love. Some sayings intensify rather than relax demands. Anger is placed beside murder, lust beside adultery. Love extends to enemies. Divorce is restricted. Other traditions depict Jesus allowing flexibility around Sabbath or purity. The overall pattern may be one of prophetic interpretation, centered on restoration, mercy, and wholehearted obedience. The gospel controversies reflect later disputes, as well as Jesus' lifetime. Matthew's Jesus can declare the continuing validity of Torah while disputing other interpreters. Mark explains Jewish customs to readers and contains a parenthetical comment, often translated as declaring all foods clean. John's polemical use of the Jews reflects a later intra-Jewish and eventually Jewish-Christian conflict, and must not be projected indiscriminately into Jesus' ministry. Jesus was not a Christian debating another religion called Judaism. Christianity did not yet exist as a separate religion. He was a Jew arguing with other Jews about Israel's God, Israel's scriptures, and Israel's future. 13. What can be known with reasonable confidence? Historical conclusions are better presented in levels than as a single list of facts. Very high confidence. Jesus existed. A first-century Jewish man named Jesus stands behind the movement. Paul's contacts with Cephas and James, early traditions, Josephus, and the rapid emergence of communities centered on a recently crucified founder make non-existence substantially less probable than existence. He was associated with Nazareth and Galilee. The repeated designation, Jesus of Nazareth, is unlikely to have been invented to satisfy messianic expectation. Nazareth carried no obvious prestige. Archaeology confirms a small Jewish settlement in the period. Whether Jesus was literally born there is less certain, but he was raised and publicly identified with it. He was baptized by John. This is one of the most broadly accepted episodes. It appears in multiple traditions and creates a potential difficulty by placing Jesus under John's authority. The episode also explains why Jesus' movement began with an apocalyptic and baptismal background. Sanders included it among his almost indisputable points. He became an itinerant teacher and kingdom preacher. the kingdom of God appears across the tradition and coheres with Jewish eschatological expectation. Jesus used parables, aphorisms, prophetic actions, and scriptural interpretation. He gathered followers. Peter, James, John, and other disciples are embedded in early and sometimes conflicting traditions. The symbolic group of 12 is historically probable, though the exact membership lists differ. He was known as a healer and exorcist. The tradition is too early, broad, and central to dismiss as a wholly late invention. History can establish reputation and activity interpreted as healing. It cannot compel agreement about supernatural causation. He went to Jerusalem and became involved in a temple incident. The event explains the sudden escalation of danger. The gospel image of Jesus single-handedly stopping the commerce of the enormous temple complex is probably narratively magnified. A limited but symbolically charged prophetic action is more historically plausible. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. This is among the strongest conclusions in the field. It is embedded in early Christian tradition, Paul, all four Gospels, Tacitus, and the political logic of Roman execution. Helen Bond calls it one of the surest facts of Christian origins. His followers quickly believed he had been raised and had appeared to them. Paul's letters place this conviction in the first generation, not in a late legendary era. The experiences transformed despair into proclamation and became the center of the movement. High confidence, though details remain uncertain. Jesus came from a family of modest status. He is called a tekton, which can mean craftsman, builder, or artisan. Carpenter is possible, but narrower than the Greek term. His social world was neither elite nor necessarily the most destitute level of village society. He spoke Aramaic. Aramaic was probably his principal language. Knowledge of Hebrew is plausible. Competence in Greek is possible but uncertain. His literacy cannot be established confidently. He directed his mission primarily to Israel. The 12, Torah debates, Israelite symbolism, and the early movement's initial Jewish character support this. Individual encounters with non-Jews may be historical, but a universal Gentile mission is more clearly developed after Easter. His message had an eschatological dimension. Exactly how imminent, cosmic, national, or symbolic it was remains debated. But removing eschatology entirely requires rejecting too many interconnected features. He used memorable parables. The exact wording cannot usually be recovered. Nevertheless, stories of seeds, debts, banquets, laborers, lost property, family conflict, and reversal fit both his setting and the recurrent form of his remembered teaching. Women participated in his movement. The Gospels preserve women as patrons, disciples, witnesses to the crucifixion, and discoverers of the empty tomb tradition. The precise roles are obscured by male-centered sources, but their presence is historically difficult to erase. Roman authorities executed him as a perceived threat. The exact legal procedure is unknown. Pilate, not an abstract collective called the Jews, possessed the power of crucifixion. Some priestly authorities may have cooperated in his arrest or transfer, especially after the temple incident. The later gospel tendency to soften Pilate and expand Jewish responsibility must be read in the context of developing Christian-Roman relations and must never be converted into collective Jewish guilt. Seriously contested. The date and place of birth. Jesus was probably born sometime before the death of Herod, if Matthew's general framework preserves history, but Luke's Quirinius census points to a later date. Bethlehem may be historical, theological, or both. Nazareth is more secure as the place of upbringing. The exact length of the ministry. A ministry of roughly 1 year fits a simple synoptic reading. 2 or 3 years fits John. No consensus resolves the chronology. The precise words of Jesus. Jesus taught principally in Aramaic, while the Gospels preserve Greek. Even genuine sayings are translations and may be condensed, expanded, or adapted. Historians can often recover characteristic themes and forms more confidently than verbatim sentences. Whether Jesus explicitly claimed to be Messiah. The royal charge at crucifixion and the movement's immediate messianic interpretation suggest that the question arose during his lifetime. Yet Jesus may have acted symbolically without publicly declaring, "I am the Messiah." The gospel trial scenes reflect post-Easter Christology as well as historical memory. What Jesus meant by Son of Man. The expression can function as an idiom for a human being, an indirect self-reference, or an allusion to the heavenly figure of Daniel 7. Scholars dispute which sayings are early and whether Jesus distinguished himself from a coming Son of Man. Whether Jesus claimed divine status. John contains explicit claims of heavenly pre-existence and unity with the Father. The synoptics present authority over forgiveness, Sabbath, demons, nature, and final judgment. But the historical interpretation of these traditions is contested. Most historians distinguish Jesus' self-understanding from the fully developed doctrines of incarnation and Trinity, which emerged through later debate. The exact reason for the arrest. The temple action, crowd enthusiasm, royal symbolism, and Passover setting probably converged. Whether the arrest followed a formal conspiracy, a rapid administrative decision, or a more complicated interaction is unknown. The Gospel Trial Narratives. A Roman interrogation is plausible. Extended private conversations between Jesus and Pilate are less readily established. The multiple Jewish hearings, exact nighttime procedure, Barabbas custom, and Pilate's reluctance remain debated. Burial by Joseph of Arimathea. The tradition is early and appears in all 4 Gospels, which supports a historical core. Yet Roman treatment of crucified victims varied, and the narrative becomes increasingly elaborate. Scholars disagree over whether Jesus received an identifiable rock-cut tomb, a more ordinary burial, or less dignified disposal. The empty tomb. Many scholars consider it historical, others regard it as uncertain or a later narrative development. Arguments include the role of women, Jerusalem proclamation, burial tradition, and the lack of an empty tomb in Paul's explicit wording. None settles the question universally. Debate also continues over whether Paul's resurrection formula presupposes an empty tomb. The nature of the resurrection appearances. The early conviction is secure. The experiences themselves are inaccessible. Scholars propose visionary experiences, grief phenomena, religious ecstasy, cognitive dissonance, individual and group encounters, bodily appearances, or some combination. Theological interpretations go beyond what shared historical method can compel. Beyond the normal competence of historical method. History cannot prove or disprove the statement that Jesus is the eternal Son of God. In the same manner, it can investigate whether Pilate governed Judea. It cannot directly measure divine intention. It cannot repeat the resurrection under controlled conditions. It cannot determine whether a healing was caused by God rather than psychosomatic recovery, spontaneous remission, social reintegration, or narrative development. This does not render theological claims meaningless. It means they are larger than historical conclusions. A believer may argue that history makes faith reasonable. A skeptic may argue that natural explanations remain preferable. But both positions add philosophical judgments about reality, causation, and what kinds of events are possible. History can bring a person to the threshold. It cannot dictate what must be believed beyond it. 14. Memory studies and the collapse of the authenticity machine. By the beginning of the 21st century, many scholars had become dissatisfied with the old image of gospel research as an archaeological excavation. The traditional model imagined layers of later material covering authentic nuggets. Apply the correct criteria, remove the church's additions, and the untouched Jesus would appear. Memory studies challenged that picture. Human beings do not first preserve uninterpreted data and only later add meaning. Remembering is already interpretive. Events are selected, narrated, connected, rehearsed, forgotten, and reshaped within social groups. Yet memory is not therefore unrestricted invention. Communities remember real people and events, often preserving durable patterns even while details change. Chris Keith, Anthony LaDon, James D. G. Dunn, Dale Allison, and others applied versions of social memory theory to Jesus traditions. They disputed the rigid authentic/inauthentic binary. A saying adapted by Matthew may still preserve Jesus' tradition. A scene containing literary construction may still rest on an event. Conversely, an apparently primitive saying is not automatically genuine. This approach changes the question from, "Did Jesus say these exact Greek words?" to broader historical inquiries. Why was Jesus repeatedly remembered as a parable teller? Why do independent traditions associate him with healings and exorcisms? Why do memories cluster around meals, conflict, the kingdom, the 12, and Jerusalem? Which patterns make sense of both his execution and the movement that survived him? The advantage is realism. The disadvantage is reduced precision. Memory theory cannot become a universal solvent that turns every narrative into memory without deciding what happened. It explains how traditions may develop, but historians must still compare sources and make judgments. The field has therefore entered a period of methodological self-examination. Scholars debate critical realism, memory, oral performance, media theory, class, gender, disability, empire, material culture, and reception history. The old dream of producing a definitive list of authentic sayings has weakened. In 2024, James Crossley and Chris Keith described historical Jesus research as having stagnated through repetitive questions and called for a next quest, attentive to methods and subjects often neglected by the classic quest narrative. Their project includes global, political, economic, and reception historical dimensions, asking not only who Jesus was, but how the search itself has operated in different cultures and systems of power. The shift does not mean that the historical Jesus has disappeared. It means that historians are more aware that their methods shape what they are capable of seeing. 15. The controversies. Behind the controversy. The debate over Jesus has never been only about ancient evidence. It has also concerned who is authorized to interpret him. For centuries, Christian institutions controlled most formal Jesus scholarship. Jewish scholars were often treated as outsiders to the interpretation of a Jewish figure. Women were largely excluded from academic institutions, and therefore from authoritative reconstruction. Colonial scholarship described Jesus and Judaism through European racial categories. Modern media rewarded the most shocking conclusions. Publishers discovered that the real Jesus sold books. Every reconstruction, therefore, has a social location. Schüssler Fiorenza and other feminist scholars asked why the historical Jesus so often emerged through methods that treated male disciples as central and women as peripheral. Sources written and transmitted largely by men may preserve only traces of women's activity. Silence cannot automatically be converted into absence. Post-colonial scholars asked whether Western quests repeated an imperial pattern. Europe claimed the authority to excavate, classify, and possess a Jewish subject from Roman Palestine. Black, Asian, Latin American, and indigenous interpreters recognized dimensions of poverty, empire, occupation, and communal identity that elite European scholarship sometimes minimized. Materialist historians emphasized taxes, land, debt, labor, elite extraction, and the political economy of Galilee. A parable about debt is not merely an abstract spiritual metaphor in a world where debt could cost land, family security, and freedom. The kingdom of God was proclaimed among people living under Herodian and Roman systems, not in a timeless spiritual landscape. Disability scholars reconsidered healing stories. A modern reader may assume that every disabled person seeks normalization. Ancient narratives can reinforce stigma by equating bodily difference with defect or sin, yet they can also depict restoration to community. Historical analysis must distinguish the experience of afflicted individuals from the theological uses later authors make of their bodies. These approaches do not automatically reveal a new, real Jesus. They expose questions previous methods failed to ask. The danger remains projection. A 21st century activist Jesus can be as anachronistic as Renan's romantic Galilean or the 19th century liberal preacher. But refusing political, gendered, or economic questions is also a projection, usually the projection of those for whom such matters remain invisible. The best historical work allows the ancient context to resist every modern appropriation. 16. Why no final biography has won. After more than 2 centuries of modern research, why has no portrait achieved universal acceptance? The first reason is the evidence. We possess no direct writing by Jesus, no contemporary biography, and no neutral observer who followed his ministry. The sources are retrospective and invested in his significance. The second is literary dependence. Matthew and Luke use Mark. John is different, but later and theologically developed. Hypothetical sources remain disputed. Counting attestations is difficult. The third is translation. Jesus' Aramaic speech reaches us mostly in Greek. Exact wording is usually unrecoverable. The fourth is chronology. The sources organize events differently and rarely provide dates. The fifth is the extraordinary speed of interpretation. Jesus was not remembered neutrally for several generations, and only later declared significant. The earliest surviving sources already interpret his death through scripture and resurrection belief. The sixth is the nature of the subject. Jesus spoke symbolically, told parables, performed enacted signs, and used eschatological language. Symbolic speech admits multiple meanings even when the words are secure. The seventh is methodological. Scholars differ over how much weight to give Mark, John, Q, Thomas, Paul, Josephus, archaeology, embarrassment, memory, and contextual plausibility. The eighth is philosophical. A historian who regards supernatural causation as impossible, will reconstruct miracle and resurrection traditions differently from one who considers such causation possible. Both may analyze the same texts carefully, while disagreeing over the best explanation. The ninth is theological investment. Christian scholars may consciously or unconsciously protect continuity between Jesus and doctrine. Skeptical scholars may prefer discontinuity. Jewish scholars may be especially alert to Christian caricatures of Judaism. Political interpreters may foreground imperial violence. None of this means that all portraits are equally good. Evidence constrains. A Jesus who was secretly a Buddhist monk, married Mary Magdalene, and founded a royal bloodline, traveled to India after surviving crucifixion, or taught modern quantum physics lacks persuasive early evidence. Historical uncertainty is not permission for unlimited invention. Some reconstructions explain more with fewer assumptions. A Jewish kingdom preacher associated with John, healing, followers, the 12, Jerusalem, temple controversy, crucifixion, and immediate resurrection belief is better supported than a wandering teacher entirely detached from eschatology or a celestial being with no earthly career. The broad outline has become clearer even while the interior portrait remains contested. 17. A historically responsible reconstruction. What then might a cautious narrative look like? Sometime near the end of Herod the Great's reign, or shortly afterward, a Jewish child named Yeshua was born and raised in or near Nazareth, a small village in Galilee. He grew up within a rural world of fields, tools, animals, debt, patronage, family obligation, taxation, scripture, pilgrimage, and expectation. He probably worked as an artisan. He spoke Aramaic. He knew Israel's traditions, whether through formal literacy, memorization, synagogue life, family instruction, or some combination. As an adult, he encountered John the Baptist, an apocalyptic preacher calling Israel to repentance through baptism. Jesus submitted to John's baptism. Something about John's movement, its urgency, prophetic power, and expectation of divine judgment, helped ignite Jesus' own vocation. After John's arrest, Jesus began an itinerant ministry in Galilee. He proclaimed the kingdom of God. He told stories drawn from village life. He gathered disciples, appointed or symbolically recognized, 12, healed, exorcised, ate with diverse people, and attracted both loyalty and controversy. His message combined gift and demand. God's reign belonged to the poor, the hungry, the humble, and those normally excluded from honor. Yet the coming kingdom required radical reorientation, forgiveness, reconciliation, relinquishment of status, intensified fidelity, trust in God, and readiness for judgment. Jesus probably believed that his activity was a sign of restoration already beginning. Whether he thought of himself principally as prophet, Messiah, Son of Man, eschatological agent, or some combination cannot be determined with confidence. His actions implied unusual authority, even where his exact claims remain uncertain. He traveled to Jerusalem during Passover. The city was crowded with pilgrims celebrating deliverance from foreign domination, while Roman troops watched for unrest. Jesus entered amid some form of acclamation and performed a disruptive prophetic action in the temple precincts. He spoke of judgment. Local authorities considered him dangerous, offensive, or destabilizing. They may have arranged his arrest and transferred him to Pilate. Roman officials interpreted the case politically. Whatever Jesus meant by God's kingdom, Rome executed him under a royal designation. He died by crucifixion, probably around 30 CE, though 33 remains possible. Crucifixion was public degradation. It announced that Rome had defeated both the victim and his claims. His followers scattered, hid, grieved, or despaired. Then some became convinced that he had appeared to them alive and that God had raised him. Peter emerged as a central witness. James, Jesus' brother, joined the leadership. Mary Magdalene became indispensable in gospel memory, even though Paul's formula omitted her. The followers reread Israel's scriptures. The failed Messiah became the suffering and vindicated Messiah. The cross became sacrifice, victory, ransom, revelation, and divine wisdom. Jesus' absence became expected return. His meals became ritual remembrance. His sayings were repeated, translated, interpreted, and adapted. Within a few years, Paul joined the movement. Within decades, communities extended across the eastern Mediterranean. By the time the Gospels were written, the memories of a Galilean prophet had become inseparable from worship of the risen Lord. This reconstruction contains probability at every stage. It is not a recovered videotape, but it accounts for the widest range of early evidence without requiring either gospel inerrancy or total invention. 18. What the historian must finally admit. The historical Jesus is both more secure and less accessible than popular debate suggests. He is more secure because the claim that nothing can be known is exaggerated. The convergence around his Jewish identity, baptism, kingdom proclamation, disciples, healing reputation, Jerusalem activity, crucifixion, and the immediate rise of resurrection belief is substantial. It rests on different kinds of evidence and explains the emergence of the movement. He is less accessible because the details most readers want are often the least recoverable. What did his voice sound like? What did he look like? Did he laugh easily? How did he understand his childhood? Was he literate? Did he privately doubt? What precisely happened at his baptism? What did he think would occur in Jerusalem? Did he foresee his death? What were his final words? What did Peter experience afterward? History cannot answer these questions with confidence. The Gospel writers were not trying to satisfy modern curiosity. They rarely describe appearance, mannerisms, or ordinary development. They tell readers who Jesus means, rather than everything he was like. That absence has permitted every age to imagine him anew. Byzantine ruler, medieval sufferer, Renaissance ideal, Protestant preacher, romantic genius, Aryan hero, Jewish Hasid, peasant revolutionary, existential summons, countercultural sage, apocalyptic prophet, liberator, mystic, capitalist, socialist, therapist, and cosmic consciousness. All have appeared beneath his name. Schweitzer's warning therefore remains alive. The searcher may discover a reflection. Yet complete skepticism becomes another mirror. It can assume that because pure objectivity is impossible, responsible judgment is impossible. It can confuse theological development with total fabrication or uncertainty with ignorance. Historical knowledge is usually neither absolute nor empty. It is graded. It emerges through argument, comparison, correction, and humility. The best scholarship, therefore, refuses two consolations. It refuses the consolation of certainty, the claim that every detail can be harmonized and historically demonstrated. It also refuses the consolation of dismissal, the claim that the sources are so theological that no real person can be discerned. Between those extremes stands a Jewish figure from Roman Galilee, partially visible, repeatedly interpreted, historically consequential, and still resistant to possession. Conclusion: the stranger who remains. The quest for Jesus began in its modern form when Reimarus's forbidden manuscript separated Jesus from his disciples. Strauss introduced myth. Renan wrote a beautiful but culturally distorted life. Rader exposed theology inside Mark. Schweitzer restored apocalyptic strangeness. Bultmann shattered confidence in biography. Käsemann reopened the search. Vermes restored Jesus' Jewish world. Sanders began with actions and consequences. Crossan found an egalitarian peasant. Wright found Israel's messianic drama. Meyer convened his imaginary conclave. Memory scholars dismantled the authenticity machine. Mythicists forced specialists to defend assumptions they sometimes took for granted. The debate continues because the evidence is finite, but the questions are not. As of the mid-2020s, scholars are again calling for a next quest, integrating memory, material culture, economics, empire, gender, global reception, and neglected voices. At the same time, detailed disputes continue over individual sources, as shown by the renewed argument about Josephus in 2025 and 2026. What do we really know? We know enough to conclude that Jesus was not created from nothing. We know enough to place him inside Jewish Galilee, beneath Herodian and Roman power. We know enough to hear recurrent themes: kingdom, reversal, restoration, judgment, mercy, healing, discipleship, and radical trust. We know enough to understand why Jerusalem was dangerous. We know enough to say that Rome crucified him. We know enough to say that his followers almost immediately believed death had not ended him. We do not know enough to reproduce a transcript of his ministry. We do not know exactly how he understood every title later applied to him. We do not know precisely what occurred between the cross and Easter proclamation, and historical method alone cannot decide whether the meaning Christians found in him originated only in human memory, or in something that broke unexpectedly into history. The stones supply names, the texts preserve voices, the contradictions expose development, the recurring patterns suggest memory, the silences enforce humility. Behind them stands not the fully harmonized Christ of later art, nor the infinitely malleable figure of modern imagination, but a first-century Jew whose life was brief, whose public activity may have lasted only a few years, and whose execution should have reduced him to one more forgotten victim of empire. Instead, his followers declared that the victim had been vindicated, the condemned man had become Lord, and history itself had changed. The historian can trace how that conviction arose and spread. The final judgment about what it means belongs to a debate larger than history, but one that history will forever disturb.
Hi, my name is David Christopher Lane. I'm a professor of philosophy at Mount San Antonio College and the founder of the Neural Server YouTube channel. I bring to you an audiobook this afternoon that is controversial. It's about the Jesus we never knew, history, myth, memory, and the search for the man behind Christianity. I used to teach a class, upper division, at the California State University of Long Beach called Religion and Science. And in that course, I'd oftentimes discuss how little we knew about certain religious figures, primarily about Siddhartha Gautama, otherwise known as the Buddha, and more precisely about Jesus. Now, if you've been brought up Catholic like I was, you have a lot of stories and a lot of anecdotes and a lot of priests and bishops and cardinals and monsignors filtering about the idea of who Jesus was. If, however, you have brought up Protestant or from a fundamentalist Christian group, you tended to look to the Bible. You might look to preachers and ministers to interpret certain passages, but you would go to the source material, or at least the source material you thought was closest to the life of Jesus. But when you did that from a scholarly or academic perspective, you discover a number of things. Number one, Jesus never wrote anything. Number two, we really don't have any information about what he looked like. Was he 5'2", 5'4", 5'6"? Was he going bald? All sorts of things that would upset people, but the fact is we just don't know. So when you go back to let's say the primary sources, which would be in the New Testament, or the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as biographies, they're not very good. You don't find out that much information, and there's a debate about what happened between the ages of, let's say, 4 to the ages of 11, and what did he do between the ages of, say, 14 up until the ministry starts at 26 or 27. Very scarce information. And what happens is I make the argument, and I get myself in some trouble, that we usually know more about our next door neighbor than we know about Buddha in terms of history, in terms of what he really was like, and also with Jesus. Now, scholars have been debating this for hundreds of years, but primarily in the last 150, 200 years, there's been this search for the historical Jesus. That is to differentiate what is maybe hagiography or mythology from what we actually might know about this real person that lived a couple thousand years ago. But even then, it's very debatable. What I suggested to my students is that you need to quote, or to mimic F. Scott Fitzgerald in his essay called The Crack-Up. The ability to hold two opposing thoughts, I'm going to butcher the quote, but two opposing thoughts in your mind, which are contradictory to each other, and still be able to function. Now, I would make the argument that you need to multiply that, have all sorts of different ideas, and be able to actually open your mind up to contrarian information, and always have the ability to be corrected or to be wrong. You oftentimes notice in debates that people just hold on to their position instead of doing the opposite, which is do a steel man or a steel woman position and take the other person's side. I say this precisely for about 10 years, almost every day, 5 days a week. I listened to the Bible Answer Man show with Hank Hanegraaff. Not because I believed in his inerrancy of the Bible or in his particular somewhat fundamentalist interpretation. No. Just because I needed to understand the way he thought or why certain fundamentalists think the way they do. But at the same turn, you need to read academic or scholarly studies, and also to actually read in the New Testament and the Old Testament, if you can, in Hebrew and, of course, in Greek. But then, of course, Jesus never apparently, as far as we can know, spoke in Greek. He most likely spoke in Aramaic, and again, there's debates about all this. So this audiobook that you're going to listen to will stir up things in your mind, whether you're a believer, a non-believer. But I think it's important because it makes you think critically and analytically. I've always made the strong argument that when it comes to religion, we have more discriminating intelligence when we buy a used car than when we buy a religion. If you ask any particular person who's really Catholic or really Christian and maybe have never really read the Bible or maybe don't know much about their faith, they'll be surprised by all the things they never knew or never even thought about. So I say this because when in my classes at Cal State Long Beach Northridge, I oftentimes have my students take the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we also did comparative studies of what they would say about the resurrection of Jesus, and they found out some unusually differences, what I would call contradictions, and which is understandable, but which is somewhat upsetting, especially in the Gospel of John, where Mary of Magdalene confuses the gardener, thinks the gardener she doesn't understand it's Jesus that she's seeing, and she thinks it's the gardener, and then only later does she recognize it's Jesus. Of course, the most beautiful part of that passage is that before she recognizes the gardener as Jesus, she asks the person, "Where have you laid his body? Where have you taken it, so that I may take care of it?" Which means that she didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus, because obviously the tomb was empty, and she didn't go, "Oh my God, he resurrected from the dead." She didn't think that at all, which indicates and suggests that many of the Christians at the time of Jesus had a completely different understanding of his ministry. Only later did they develop or evolve a different understanding. That tells me something about early Christianity that a lot of people don't think of. Today it's a lot been homogenized. You know, nobody remembers that there's all these other Gospels that got thrown out, the Gospel of Thomas, and there's some spurious Gospels, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary of Magdalene, and a lot of people forget about the Gnostic Gospels, of course, which were more or less suppressed until the discovery of Nag Hammadi in the 1940s. Well, when we do these comparative analysis, you start to understand why it's very difficult for a skeptic or even an atheist to believe in the objectivity of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this gets even more controversial when you read, I think it's in the Gospel of Mark, if I'm not mistaken. I think it may be Gospel of Matthew, where when Jesus dies, the saints resurrect, basically, come out of the grave and head to Jerusalem. But no historian, not Josephus, no Tacitus, no Pliny, talks about it. Now just play that out in your head. Imagine that the dead rise again, and they come out of the grave, and they're going to a town, popular town, but no historian talks about that? That's not more significant? And everybody talks about, the uniqueness of the resurrection of Jesus. But it's not unique if the saints are resurrecting from the dead and walking to Jerusalem. Now, of course, we can also mention Lazarus. And also you have to go back to earlier myths, which they had resurrection accounts as well. Now I'm not trying to say I know, I'm not trying to dismiss, I'm not trying to be hypercritical. I'm just simply saying that there's all this information, when you really actually look at the text itself, will raise lots of questions that oftentimes people don't want to answer, or maybe they don't want to ponder. Now, my bias, and I'll just, I could be completely wrong, my bias is that the more you understand or appreciate and accept the humanness of Jesus, or a Buddha, or a Guru Nanak, or anybody, Muhammad, anybody, the more you accept the humanness of it, the closer you're going to get to the truth of that situation. The more that you give it 100 years, 1,000 years, you can romanticize anything. But the closer you go back in time, the more you realize that somebody sweat, somebody urinated, somebody smelled, somebody had doubts, somebody was confused. Then you start to realize the humanness of it all. And that's why I always use that quote from Nietzsche, human, all too human. And I believe that the great liberation in religion is when we understand the humanity of all our religious leaders with no exceptions. Now, I know that in my own tradition, I've gotten some heat, some hate mail, when I argue that the gurus of the Radha-Swami tradition are just human beings and make mistakes and do all sorts of things that they shouldn't have done. And that we need to acknowledge that. Which is the idea that we think that somebody is God or somebody is the incarnation of God. What it really demands is not extraordinary evidence, extraordinary proof and all that. What it really demands is for us to look into the mirror and say, what is it that I'm worshiping here? Is it an idealization? Is it an image? Is it a picture I saw? Is it my indoctrination when I was a kid? Because what you start to understand is that many of the models, and I'm thinking of Nicholas of Cusa, and here I'm quoting a Catholic cardinal to kind of support my contention here, is that when you think about Jesus or Buddha or whomever, you have an idealized image of it. The problem is that idealized image is wrong. All images of whatever sort of the infinity to which you think you're pointing are going to be, insufficient. This is what Nicholas of Cusa meant when he said, the unattainable is attained by its unattainment. And this is also what he meant when no matter what kind of square you have, you can't circle it, or no matter what kind of octagon you have, you can't get it to encompass the circle. The circle has to be what it is, which means it's beyond our comprehension. And we are just little chipmunks. We have these really tiny, puny brains trying to understand a universe that's way beyond our comprehension. And then we pontificate as if we know something. I'll put this more bluntly. Most people couldn't have recognized Jesus in a mug lineup because nobody has a description of what he really looked like. How tall he was, how good looking he was, or how not good looking he was. Nobody knows. And from that, I always make this argument that if somebody had a near-death experience and at the end of the tunnel they saw Jesus, let's say, how do you know it's Jesus? How do you know it's not a holographic illusion? The fact is you don't. Are you going to card it? Are you going to ID it? Or are you going to simply say, I listened to that loser Lane talk about skepticism, and all of a sudden I don't know if it's Jesus? See, this gets to a really fundamental issue about our own ignorance, which is the issue of epistemology. Like, how do you know? And I really feel strongly that the more we confess to how much we don't know, we'll get more information in the process. So that means, let me rip myself here. That doesn't mean I know and this is the way it should be. I just know, in this sense, that if I keep my skepticism in a good, positive way, I will shut up, more or less, and listen to different sides, like I did with the Bible Answer Man show for 10 years. Because that's more important than me holding on to some image and some idealization and some position that I can't, I fight tooth and nail for, and therefore I can never be wrong. One of the things I've learned being 70 years old, I'm always potentially wrong. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you.